The fire in the forge had been breathing since before dawn. Elias Cord fed it the way other men fed a sick animal, carefully, without sentiment, but with a kind of understanding that passed between living things. He had learned the fire's moods the same way he had learned everything worth knowing, through the slow accumulation of burns. The scars on his forearms ran in pale ridges like dried riverbeds, some old enough to have gone silver, others still pink and raised enough to catch the light when he moved a certain way. His neck carried the worst of it, a twisted seam from jaw to collarbone where the skin had healed wrong after the smelter accident in '71, puckered at the center and glossy at the edges, the kind of scar that made strangers look away and children stare. His face beneath it was not unkind, but it was the face of a man who had stopped asking the world for kindness in return, and that quality had settled into his features the way weather settles into old wood, permanently, without apology. That was the year he stopped speaking in full sentences. Not because the burn had taken his voice, the doctor out of Laramie had assured him it hadn't, had pressed a metal instrument against his throat and declared the mechanism intact, but because somewhere in the weeks of fever and laudanum and ceiling staring, he had simply lost the habit, and found that silence suited him better than words ever had. Words required engagement, words invited response. Silence was a tool, like any other. You learned when to use it and when to set it down, and Cord had arrived at the conclusion that most occasions called for the tool and very few required anything else. He worked alone. That was the arrangement, and it suited Burnt Creek just fine. The town had 17 functioning adults, 2 of whom were too old to function in any practical sense, and 1 blacksmith shop situated at the eastern edge of the settlement where the smell of coal smoke would not drift over the dry goods store or the church. Cord had built the shop himself, 8 years ago, after coming west from a place he did not discuss. He had arrived in Burnt Creek on a gray horse with a saddlebag of tools, a bedroll, and nothing else that anyone could see. He had spoken to the town's informal representative, a man named Greer, who had since died of a liver complaint, for approximately 4 minutes, established that there was no working smithy within 20 miles, and started building the next day. The walls were stone where he had had the patience for stone, and timber where he had not. It was a working building, not a pretty one. He had a cot in the back, a small stove for cooking, and a shelf of books he had read so many times the spines had gone soft. He did not own land beyond the footprint of his shop. He did not need to. The Halverson farm lay a quarter-mile north, visible through the open front doors of his forge on clear mornings. A yellow farmhouse that looked smaller every year, the way buildings do when they are not being properly kept. The paint had been fading toward the color of old bone for 3 years now. The fence along the south pasture leaned with the patient lean of things that have been meaning to fall for a long time. Margaret Halverson had come to that farm as a young bride 12 years ago, arriving from somewhere in Ohio, with good hands and a practical face, and a husband named Tobias who had more ambition than the land could always reward. Tobias had died of a chest sickness 2 winters back. Cord had heard the coughing through the winter nights long before the news made its official way to him, and had understood what it meant before anyone told him. Margaret had been working the farm alone since then, with her 13-year-old boy, Seth, who was good with animals and better with silence than most grown men Cord had ever met. The boy sometimes came to watch Cord work. He would appear in the doorway without announcing himself, the way animals appear, suddenly present rather than arriving, and watch the hammer fall with the focused attention of someone storing information against future use. Cord would acknowledge him with a tilt of his head, and they would spend an hour in each other's company without either of them needing a word. It was a comfortable arrangement. Cord had found that the people he respected most in the world were people who understood that not everything required comment. He noticed things about the farm the way a man notices the condition of a horse he has not been asked to tend, with a professional detachment that did not quite prevent caring. He noticed when the south fence started leaning in October and worsened through November without repair. He noticed when the barn roof developed a sag that Seth could not fix alone, the kind of sag that began at a failing rafter and worked its way outward over time, slow and inevitable. He noticed when the boy stopped coming to watch, sometime in early October. Around the same time, a new wagon started appearing in front of the farmhouse. A black lacquered thing with brass fittings that caught the winter light and threw it back in an ostentatious way, pulled by a matched pair of bays that cost more than Cord made in 6 months. The wagon appeared and disappeared at intervals that did not correspond to any pattern he could read as ordinary commerce. He knew whose wagon it was. Everyone in Burnt Creek knew. Royce Alderman had come to the territory 3 years ago with a lawyer's leather case and a surveyor's eye, and enough paper money from somewhere back east to buy himself influence and patience in roughly equal measure. He was a tall man, narrow through the shoulders, with hair that was always clean and a coat that was always pressed. His hands were the hands of a man who had never worked with them, but who had made other men's work into a profitable study. He had purchased the old Schiller tract north of town, then the 2 homesteads that bordered it, always for prices fair enough to prevent complaint and low enough to reveal what lay underneath. He was working towards something that anyone with eyes could see, though no one in town seemed willing to name it plainly, in the same way no one is willing to be the first to name a storm while it is still over the mountains. He smiled the way a man smiles when he has already calculated what you are worth to him and found the number manageable. He had been to the Halverson farm 4 times in October, 5 in November, 3 in December, though December was brutal and the roads into the valley were hard-packed mud alternating with ice, and the man in the lacquered wagon navigated them anyway, which told you everything you needed to know about how important the errand was to him. Cord watched the wagon come and go. He said nothing, because he said nothing to anyone about anything that was not directly related to the work at hand. But his hammer fell harder on those mornings, and the iron he shaped came out with a precision that bordered on anger, clean and relentless and better than it needed to be. The boy appeared in the doorway on a Wednesday in late January, when the cold had settled into the valley like a permanent tenant who had decided the lease was indefinite. He was wearing a coat too thin for the weather and boots that had been resoled with leather that did not quite match the original. Careful work, competent work, the work of someone who had learned to make things last past their natural lifespan because the alternative was going without. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of poor sleep over a long period, and his jaw had the set of a person carrying weight he had not told anyone about, which on a 13-year-old face looked older than it had any right to. Cord glanced at him and returned to the hinge he was setting. He was making a set of cabinet hinges for the Brennan family. Small work, delicate work, the kind that required more attention than strength. The iron had to be worked thin without going brittle, the pin fitted tight without going seized. It was the kind of precision that he found, on difficult days, easier to give to metal than to most other things. Seth stood in the doorway for a while, with the cold air pushing past him into the shop. Cord could feel the boy's discomfort the way you feel weather coming, a change in pressure, something unsettled in the air that had not yet committed to a direction. Eventually the boy spoke. His voice had been breaking for months and had not decided which register it belonged to yet, lurching between registers mid-sentence in a way that would have embarrassed him if he had been the kind of boy who embarrassed easily. He was not. "Mr. Cord, you know a man named Alderman?" Cord set the hinge on the anvil and looked at the boy. He nodded once. "He wants our farm." Seth said it without apparent emotion, in the flat, declarative manner of a person who has lived with a fact long enough that the shock has worn away and left only the bare shape. "He has been wanting it since last spring. He has got a note, a debt note, that Pa signed before he died, for the seed money 2 seasons back. Alderman bought it from the bank in Cheyenne. Mama did not know. The bank did not tell her, just sold it. She found out when Alderman came to the door in October with the paper in his hand." The boy paused. He was looking at the fire, not at Cord, the way people look at fire when they are saying something too heavy to look at directly. Mama does not have the money. She has been trying. She sold the 2 milk cows and the spare wagon and some of Pa's tools, but it is not enough. He gave her until the 1st of March. He says if she cannot pay by then, he will file with the county court and they will have 30 days after the ruling comes down. Cord let the silence sit between them for a moment. It was the kind of silence that had texture, not empty, but occupied by the weight of what had been said. He looked at the boy, at the coat that was too thin and the boots that had been repaired one too many times, and he nodded again, very slowly, the way you nod at something you had suspected but had hoped to be wrong about. Seth stayed another half hour and left without saying goodbye, which was their normal manner of parting. Cord listened to the sound of boots on frozen ground going away, and then there was just the fire, and the hinge, and the cold air coming through the open doors. He continued setting the hinge. His hands were steady. His face was still. Inside his chest, something had shifted that did not shift back, like a plate of stone settling into a new position in a wall, where it would hold permanently. He spent the rest of the day working and thinking in the way that was natural to him, thoughts moving through him the way heat moves through iron, slow and even and thorough, reaching every part before they finished. He thought about Margaret Halverson, whom he had never spoken to directly in 8 years of living a quarter-mile from her house. He had seen her at the general store, at the church on the occasions he attended, at the single community gathering the town held each summer. She was a compact woman, not pretty in any conventional sense, her face too angular, her hands too rough, but possessed of a fortitude that showed in her posture and in the steadiness of her gaze. She had never looked at his scars the way most people looked at them, with that brief, involuntary flinch, the eyes flicking away and back, in the guilty overcorrection of a person trying to seem unaffected. She had looked at his face the way she looked at weather, as a fact, requiring assessment rather than reaction. He had respected that for 8 years and done nothing about it, because the distance between respecting something and having any right to act on that respect was the size of the whole territory. He also knew, with a clarity that required no examination, that he had no standing to interfere in her life. None at all. He was a scarred, silent man who shod horses and made hinges and kept to himself. And she was a woman navigating the slow catastrophe of losing everything her husband had built. These were 2 separate problems, belonging to 2 separate people. He kept telling himself that as he banked the forge for the night. He was still telling himself that as he lay on his cot with his book open and unread, the words sitting on the page doing nothing, while the wind came down from the mountains and scraped along the stone walls of his shop like something trying to get in. By morning, he had stopped telling himself that and started making calculations instead. Part 3. The Weight of a Number. The debt was $460. He confirmed this through Hank Brubaker, who ran the dry goods store and talked enough for 8 men and had the particular talent for making information gathering feel like casual conversation, which was how it got done in a town this size. Cord mentioned, with studied indifference, that he had heard something about banking trouble at the Halverson place. Brubaker had spent 11 minutes delivering everything he knew, which was nearly everything there was to know. $460. Due to Alderman by the 1st of March. The original loan had been $220, reasonable money for a season's seed and supplies, but there had been interest compounded at a rate that did not quite match what the Cheyenne Bank publicly advertised, plus legal fees for the note transfer, plus what Alderman called an administrative assessment, which was a phrase Cord had never encountered in connection with a debt note, and which carried the smell of a number that had been decided upon first and described afterward. The 1st of March was 36 days away. Cord laid the number against what he had, with the same honesty he brought to assessing raw stock before shaping it. No flattery, no wishful thinking. He had $63 in a coffee tin under the floorboard near his cot, saved carefully across 8 years of simple living and limited wants. He had no debts and no dependents, and no expenses beyond feeding himself, maintaining the forge, and replacing tools as they wore out. He had 2 horses acquired in trade, a gray gelding and a brown mare, both serviceable, neither exceptional. He needed $397 more in 36 days. He got out his ledger and worked the problem with the same focus he brought to a difficult fitting, looking for where material existed, where it could be shaped, where the margin lived. 7 items pending. He wrote new figures beside each. Days required, materials cost, revised price. He had spent 8 years charging prices that were fair toward the center of fair. He was going to need to charge prices toward the high end of fair, which was different, and which he had always avoided from a stubbornness that he now recognized as the luxury of a man with nothing urgent to accomplish. He was no longer that man. Not for the next 36 days. He also thought about other things, harder things. He thought about Alderman and what he knew of him, and what he knew of men who bought debt and waited. He had met this species before, in other territories, in the years before he came west. He understood their structure. They operated in the space between legality and decency, using the distance between those two things as their working room. They depended on paper and patience and the friction of geography. 40 miles between a county seat and a small settlement was enough friction to make accountability optional. They depended on appearing legitimate. He thought about what it would take to remove that appearance. He put that thinking away in the back of his mind, where he kept things he was not ready to act on yet, and went back to work. Part 4. Iron Hours. He began before the sun did. The forge was hot by 4 in the morning, not warming up, not comfortable, but working hot, the kind of heat that means business from the first minute. By the time pale winter light touched the floor of the shop in a thin gray stripe, he had completed a full set of gate hinges, 2 drawer pulls, and the first half of a wagon wheel rim that a farmer named Dutton had ordered in November and stopped asking about in December, under the reasonable assumption that Cord would get to it in his own time. Cord dispatched word through a passing rider that the rim was done and could be collected. He did not stop to eat between the gate hinges and the drawer pulls. He did not stop between the drawer pulls and the rim. He stopped when the rim was finished because the fire needed coal and his body needed water, and those were the minimum terms on which the work continued. He worked with a focus that was different in kind from his ordinary concentration. His ordinary focus was the focus of a man doing the thing he was made for, something close to contentment, or at least its working man's equivalent, the deep satisfaction of skill applied to resistant material. This was not that. This was the narrower, colder focus of a man who has identified a fixed point and is moving toward it by whatever means are available, without the luxury of preference about the means. He took no breaks beyond what the fire and his body would not permit him to ignore. He ate standing up when he ate at all, cold food mostly, whatever was quickest to consume with one hand while the other remained occupied. He slept in 4-hour intervals, waking to check the fire and feed it, sleeping again. He had spent his career developing the blacksmith's relationship with physical pain, which was to say, he treated it as information rather than instruction. The ache in his forearms and shoulders told him where the work was accumulating. It did not tell him to stop, and he did not treat it as though it did. On the 9th day, he sharpened every tool in the shop. The chisels and punches and hardies and swages he had been meaning to dress for months and had kept postponing, as you postpone the maintenance that enables the work when the work itself is pressing. He found afterward that the iron yielded more readily, that strikes accomplished what they were intended to accomplish with less correction required. He had been losing, he estimated, 4 or 5% of his efficiency to tools he had not maintained, and he sat with that fact for a moment before releasing it, because regret is only useful insofar as it changes practice, and the practice had been changed. In the second week, he went looking for work rather than waiting for it. He rode to 3 farms within a day's ride and asked, in his abrupt and efficient way, whether there was ironwork outstanding. There was always ironwork outstanding. The Gallagher brothers had a cracked axle sleeve on their freight wagon that had been waiting since fall. The McCready place needed 3 plowshares resharpened and a 4th replaced outright, the steel too thinned by use to hold an edge worth speaking of. Old Parson Built, not actually a parson, a distinction that had ceased to matter, needed his water pump repaired, which required 2 separate rides and a fabricated replacement part and cold, stiff fingers on the installation, and earned $22 that felt considerably heavier than their face value. He sold the gray gelding on the 15th day. The horse had come to him 3 years ago as partial payment for work, lean and nervous, and had become fat and merely nervous under Cord's care, which was an improvement. He sold him to a man passing through who needed a remount and had no options to speak of. $35 for a horse worth $42, and Cord accepted the shortfall without negotiating, because the man who cannot afford to wait is the man who pays the most by insisting on waiting. And he understood now with absolute clarity what his time cost per day. He took a job he normally would have declined, decorative work for a new hotel in Bent Creek, 8 iron sconces requiring finish work that was fussier than his inclination. He charged for the fussiness. The hotel owner paid without objection because there was no one else to ask, which meant the price was whatever Cord said it was, and Cord said it was a fair number toward the high end of fair. At the end of 3 weeks, he had added $178 to the tin. He needed 219 more in 15 days. He wrote the number in his ledger. He underlined it once. He did not call it impossible, because impossibility is a description of things that have been tried and failed, and this had not been tried enough yet. He went back to the anvil. Part 5. What he saw at night. On the 19th day, he saw the wagon again. He was returning from delivering a repaired harness assembly to a man 2 miles east of town, walking because the road was iced and he had left his remaining horse at the shop. The evening was doing what it did in winter out here, putting on an extravagance of color just before going cold and dark, orange and deep red against the mountains, the kind of sky that would have looked excessive in a painting. He came around the bend in the road that opened onto the view of the lower valley and saw the black lacquered wagon parked in front of the Halverson farmhouse, its brass fittings catching the last of the orange light, and saw Alderman on the porch. Margaret Halverson was in the doorway, not on the porch, the doorway, which communicated something specific. The threshold she had not crossed outward to receive him, the threshold he had not been invited across inward. Her hands were at her sides, her chin was up. Even at 200 yards, across a field and a fence line in fading winter light, Cord could read the geometry of it. A woman holding her ground on ground she might not keep, and a man with one hand resting on her porch post as though the accounting were already settled. Cord stood on the road. He stood there for a moment that was longer than a moment, and something moved through him that had no clean name. Not quite anger. Anger implies you expected better, and he had not expected better from Alderman. Something older and more structural than anger. Something that lived in the hands and not in the head, that knew what it wanted to do without needing to consult anything higher. He walked on, because there was nothing he could do about it tonight, and because the state he was in was not useful for anything except work, and he needed to get back to the forge. He worked until 2 in the morning without noticing what he was making. When he looked at the finished product by lantern light, he found he had made 3 iron roses. The petals hammered thin enough to flex slightly in a strong wind. The stems curved with a naturalism he had not consciously aimed for. He had no commission for them, no buyer waiting. He had made them from some impulse he did not examine closely, out of a specific pressure that had been building in him since October, and that the evening's observation had intensified to the point where it needed somewhere to go. He set them aside on the finished goods shelf, where they looked improbable among the brackets and hardware, and went to sleep. What he thought about in the dark before sleep came was Royce Alderman. He gave himself permission now to look at it directly, the way you give yourself permission to look at something that has been in your peripheral vision for weeks. He thought about the structure of Alderman's operation as he understood it from 8 months of observation and Brubaker's steady supply of information. The man was careful. He always had paper. He always had a lawyer attached somewhere, a man in Cheyenne who prepared and certified the documentation. He understood that distance from the centers of law and commerce was a resource, not infinite, but vast enough to operate in without significant risk of audit. But men like that had foundations they depended on. Paper, documented legitimacy, the unimpeachable face of a businessman. Remove one foundation and the weight above it had to go somewhere. Cord thought about what he knew of Alderman's office in Bent Creek, the sealed room above the saloon, the external staircase, the window on the second floor whose latch he had noticed on the one occasion he had had business in that building, filed away with everything else he noticed, against some future use that had not yet declared itself. He thought for a long time. When he slept without guilt, which might have meant something about him, or might have meant that he had not yet finished deciding what he was going to do, and guilt requires a finished decision. Part 6. The Money. On the 28th day, he counted what was in the tin. He spread the money on the workbench while the forge was heating, the coins stacked by denomination, the bills laid flat and counted twice. He had a craftsman's relationship with accuracy. Approximate was useful for some things and useless for others, and this was one of the others. $441, $19 beyond the debt. He stood at the workbench and looked at the money for a while. His hands were holding the edge of the bench, and they looked, in the early morning light, like the hands of someone who had been engaged in serious work for a long time, cut and blistered and roughened past what they had been a month ago, with a new scar on the second knuckle of the right hand, where a misdirected strike on the 14th day had opened the skin. It had healed badly, leaving a small permanent pucker over the bone. He had enough scars that one more made no appreciable difference to the inventory. He had completed, in 28 days, work that would have been a respectable output for a fully staffed shop over 6 weeks. He had done it alone, in a single-room forge, with tools that had needed sharpening, in weather that was hostile to the kind of precision the work required. He had eaten badly and slept less than was advisable, and had not spoken to anyone beyond the minimum required to conduct business. He put the money back in the tin. He replaced the floorboard. He cooked himself the most substantial meal he had eaten in 3 weeks. Salt pork, properly prepared beans, cornbread that was imperfect but edible, and sat at his small table and ate it slowly, without reading, which was unusual. He generally always had a book open when he ate. Tonight he sat with the fact of what he had done and let it occupy the space it required. Then he thought about what remained, and the near satisfaction became something more textured and complicated. Because paying the debt was necessary, it was not sufficient. A man like Alderman, presented with a satisfied note, would simply wait. He would find another angle. He had invested patience as well as money in the Halverson land, and he would not write off that investment over one obstacle. The farm would be safe for a season, possibly 2, and then he would be back with something new. Cord had known this from the beginning. He had built the additional work, the extra nights, the additional risk, into the plan before he started. The debt payment was the visible part. The rest was the part that would actually hold. Part 7. The Frame. He needed 2 nights and he took them. What he had in mind was not complicated. Complexity was the enemy of reliable execution in metalwork and in everything else. It required patience and access, and a quality of deliberate coldness that he found, when he examined himself, he possessed without any particular effort, which was not something he had ever thought to advertise. The first night, he rode east to Bent Creek on his remaining horse. He left at midnight, arrived at 2, tied the mare behind the livery where she would be quiet and unseen, and spent 40 minutes watching the building where Alderman kept his office before he moved toward it. The patience required to stand still in that cold for 40 minutes was the same patience required to wait for iron to reach its working temperature without rushing it. You did not rush it because what you made in the right time held, and what you made in a hurry failed. The window on the second floor was unlatched. He had noticed this 2 months ago on the one occasion he had delivered hardware to the saloon below, his eyes passing over the latch in its absence, filing the information without knowing why, the way he filed everything. The external staircase was accessible from the alley. He went up it with the deliberateness of a man who has decided, testing each step for sound before committing. He went through the window. He was careful about what he touched, and careful to wear leather against everything he did touch. The desk was good furniture, heavy walnut, a locked center drawer that opened in 8 seconds with a pin he had shaped for the purpose in his own forge 3 weeks ago. Inside were things that were interesting in several ways. Debt notes, more than 40 of them, property spread across the valley, names he recognized and names he did not, a map of patient accumulation. Survey documents with county clerk stamps, and behind the surveys, in a separate leather sleeve, 3 sets of documents he recognized as forged. Not from any specialized knowledge, from the metalwork. He had spent his career understanding how metal struck against material leaves a mark, and these stamps had been made with dies set at a fractional angle, producing impressions that were consistently shallower on the left side than the right. A craftsman would have noticed and corrected this before use. A counterfeiter would not know to notice. Alderman had been filing false land surveys. 3 of them, each representing significant claimed acreage, each carrying the same flawed stamp. Cord memorized what was there and then placed what he had brought. A bill of sale, handwritten in a commercial style he had spent 3 evenings developing, referencing a property not in Alderman's portfolio, in an amount that would require explaining. Written in a hand that was not his, practiced from examples he had observed at Brewbaker's, every practice sheet burned before he was satisfied. 7 bills of currency, specific denominations, held by Cord for years from a man who had absolutely deserved to lose them. The serial numbers were part of a sequence flagged in a federal circular following a Kansas counterfeiting operation that had been partially dismantled in the late 1870s. Documented, flagged, not all recovered. A key that opened nothing, made in his own forge to the proportions of a bank vault key. In isolation, meaningless. In context, something waiting to be explained. He reset the false bottom of the desk drawer so it sat just slightly proud of its fitting, enough for a careful searcher to find, not enough for a casual glance to notice. He went back out the window, down the stairs, through the alley, and was back on the road before 3 o'clock. The second part was shorter and required a different kind of care. Part 8. The Letter. He composed the letter over 2 evenings, unusual for him because he did not normally revise, believing in getting things right before committing rather than after. But this required the kind of precision that sometimes needed iteration, the way a complex fitting needs to be test-assembled before it is permanently joined. The letter went to Marshal Cade Riker in Holt, 40 miles north, a man with a reputation for being thorough, if slow, for following evidence regardless of where it led or whom it inconvenienced, for not being in anyone's pocket that Cord had been able to establish. It was written on paper purchased specifically for this purpose, with a broad-nibbed pen that spread ink widely enough to obscure individual letter characteristics. It described the desk, the drawer, the false bottom, and the forged surveys with enough specificity to be useful and enough restraint to sound like genuine observation rather than constructed narrative. It described the currency and its significance. It described the bill of sale. It expressed appropriate uncertainty about the key, which was honest because the key did not actually open anything and Cord was not going to claim otherwise in a document he had to stand behind, even anonymously. It was signed, "A concerned party who cannot safely give their name." He gave it to a drover passing through, a man he had never met, headed north, the kind of man who moved through the territory without asking too many questions about what he was carrying or for whom. $2 to deliver it personally to the marshal's office in Holt. The drover pocketed the money and rode north, and Cord watched him go from the doorway of his shop in the cold morning air. Then he stood there for a while, and went through what he had done in the honest way he went through everything he did not want to examine too closely. He had broken and entered. He had planted fabricated evidence alongside genuine evidence of genuine crimes, knowing that the combination would be more damaging than either element alone, and that no one would be able to distinguish the planted from the real. He had forged a document. He had written an anonymous letter designed to direct law enforcement at a specific man. He did not tell himself this was clean work. It was not. He held that truth without flinching. He had operated in the shadow space between justice and its performance, using methods that were themselves crimes in service of an outcome he believed, without illusion, without romance, was closer to right than to wrong. What he had not done was invent Alderman's guilt. The forged surveys were real. The manipulated debt transfers were real. He had not fabricated a criminal where no criminal existed. He had only built a road to the criminal that the law would not have found on its own. He accepted this. He went back to the fire, which needed tending. Part 9. The Paying. On the last day of February, he put $460 into a plain envelope and sealed it with wax. On the front, in his careful, obscuring hand, "For the debt against the Halverson Farm property held by R. Alderman of Bent Creek. Payment in full. Sender requires no acknowledgement." A second, larger envelope went to Alderman directly, at his Bent Creek address. Inside was the sealed payment envelope and a single additional page. The enclosed sum satisfies in full the debt note held against the property of M. Halverson. You are expected to furnish written receipt of this payment to Mrs. Halverson within 7 days of this letter's receipt. Failure to do so will result in this matter being raised with the appropriate legal authorities. This is the only communication you will receive on this subject. No signature, no return address. A threat that was precise and achievable, and therefore credible. He handed both envelopes to Brubaker with the correct postage and the expression he used to discourage extended questioning. Brubaker managed 4 seconds. "Who's the Bent Creek letter for?" "Business," Cord said, and walked out. He went back to his shop and made cabinet hinges. He made them carefully, with clean angles and smooth pin action, because the quality of a thing has nothing to do with whether anyone is watching you make it. He ate a real meal that evening, the first in 3 weeks that could honestly be called one, and sat afterward on his cot and thought about what he had put in motion and what he could and could not control from here. He thought about Margaret Halverson receiving a piece of paper that said her debt was paid, arriving without explanation, without a name attached, arriving the way weather arrives, as a fact requiring only acceptance, not understanding. He hoped she would accept it that way. He hoped she would not spend too much of herself trying to trace it, because the tracing would lead nowhere useful, and the time spent on it was time she could use for the farm. These were things he was allowed to hope for. They were not things he had any right to need, and he did not allow himself to need them. Part 10. March. Spring came late that year, grudging and conditional, threatening every warm afternoon to reverse itself and go back to cold, the way high country springs always seemed to negotiate with the season they were replacing. The receipt reached the Halverson farm on a Tuesday in the second week of March. Cord saw Margaret Halverson walk to her mailbox in the mid-morning, saw her take the paper, stand at the box, read it. She stood there for a time that was longer than the paper's length would have required. Then she went inside. He was too far away to see her face. He returned to the bracket he was shaping and made the final correction to the angle and held it up against the light. It was right. 2 weeks later, the news arrived through Brubaker, delivered with tremendous enthusiasm, as though Brubaker had been saving it for exactly this moment, that a marshal and 2 deputies had spent most of a Thursday going through Royce Alderman's office in Bent Creek with notable thoroughness. The legal situation was described as extensive. Alderman had retained lawyers in Cheyenne. He had not been seen in Burnt Creek since. The receipt eventually made its way to Margaret Halverson. 3 weeks late, delayed, Cord understood, by the particular complexity of a man whose lawyers were managing multiple pressing problems simultaneously and who needed to eliminate each potential additional liability as efficiently as possible. But it came because not sending it was a worse exposure than sending it. Seth mentioned it in the doorway on a Thursday afternoon in April. He had grown half an inch since January and was wearing a coat that fit and boots that did not need to be explained. "Mama got a paper says the note is paid." Cord nodded. She does not know where it came from. Cord set a bracket in the fire to reheat. It had gone slightly off on the right angle, a few degrees, enough to cause problems at installation. "She thinks maybe it was someone who knew Pa." Cord waited for the bracket to come to temperature. He watched the color come up in the metal, the dull red deepening toward orange. "Mr. Alderman has got legal trouble," Seth said. "Heard. Mama says we are going to be okay." He pulled the bracket and made the correction. 4 strikes. He held it up. The angle was right. The fitting would be clean. "Good," Cord said. 1 word. He had found, over many years, that the craft of knowing which things required 1 word and which required more was worth practicing. This was a 1-word moment. Seth stayed until the bracket was done, then left without ceremony, the way he always left. Cord listened to the sound of boots going away across the packed dirt. And then there was just the fire. Part 11. After. He did not feel absolved. He had not done any of it in order to feel absolved, and he was suspicious of absolution in general, having found that it was usually something people gave themselves too readily. He worked. He always worked. The forge breathed every morning before dawn and cooled every night after midnight, and what filled the hours between was the particular and honest exchange of skill for material that had been the organizing principle of his life for longer than anything else had managed. He made tools and hardware and a weather vane he had not planned, a horse at full extension, running, that emerged over 4 days of finish work from somewhere he could not quite identify. He sold it to the Gallagher brothers for $12, and felt a quiet and inexplicable regret about it afterward. Some things you make, and they feel like they were always going to be yours. Seth came back to the doorway in April. He stood there in the old way, suddenly present without preamble, watching the hammer fall with the same stored attention he had always brought. Cord was working on a plow fitting, the kind of job that is not interesting in any way but is necessary, and he did not slow down or change what he was doing. After a while, Seth said, "Mama got a paper says the note is paid." He said other things. Cord said a word here and there, the minimum of syllables required to confirm he was listening. The conversation, such as it was, reached its natural conclusion, and Seth left, and the day continued. The Sunday after, Cord walked to church. Once a month, more for the architecture than the theology, for the specific quality of silence inside stone walls on a cold morning. Margaret Halverson was there with Seth. She was wearing a clean dress, and her face had a quality it had not had in months, something returned to it, some specific weight removed. He sat 3 rows back and to the left. He did not look at her during the service. After the service, in the cold morning outside while the community redistributed itself into smaller conversations, He was pulling on his gloves and preparing to walk back when he became aware that she was looking at him. He could tell without looking, the way you can tell that a heat source is near you without looking directly at it. He did not look away from what he was doing. He finished with his gloves and then looked up, because looking away from things was not a habit he had allowed himself to develop. She was looking at him from the church steps. Her expression was not readable in any simple way. It was not gratitude. Gratitude toward an unknown is a theoretical thing, not an expression on a specific face. It was something more like the look a person gives when they are holding a question they have decided not to ask, because asking it would change the nature of the thing they are asking about. She gave him a small nod. Just that. He returned it, barely perceptible, and walked home. He thought about the nod for a while, in the evenings, in the spare minutes between one task and the next. He did not arrive at any particular conclusion about it. It was a nod. It was what it was. He had done what he had done, and she did not know what he had done, and the appropriate distance between them was the same as it had always been. The distance between neighbors who have lived parallel lives for 8 years and have no particular reason to narrow that gap. He did not find this conclusion satisfying. He found it accurate, which was different, and which would have to do. Part 12. What the Town Remembered. Burnt Creek remembered Elias Cord the way small places remember their quieter fixtures, incompletely, around the edges, in the specific preserved details that outlast the larger shape of a life. They remembered that he never charged more than the work was worth, and never less, and that these two qualities together made him more trustworthy than most people who only managed one of them. They remembered the scars, because the scars were visible, and people noticed visible things. They remembered that he was the last lamp extinguished at night and the first fire lit in the morning, that he spoke in units of 1 and 2 syllables and meant what every syllable said, that he was good to the Halverson boy in the way a man can be good to a young person without making it into something that required acknowledgement. They remembered the iron rose above his door, one mounted above the door frame of the shop, the only ornament he kept among the tools and the coal and the finished goods waiting for collection. It was a curling, precise thing, the petals hammered thin enough to move slightly in wind, technically unnecessary and technically perfect. The kind of object that raises questions about what its maker was thinking when he made it, questions that are unanswerable after the maker is gone. Seth Halverson apprenticed with him at 16. He had the hands for it. Either the material speaks to you or it does not, and with Seth it had always spoken. From the first afternoon he stood in the doorway watching the hammer fall. By 19 he was the more precise craftsman, his finished work carrying a quality that exceeded what Cord himself produced. And Cord knew this and said nothing about it, which Seth eventually understood was the specific form of acknowledgement that Cord used for things he respected most. They did not know, in Burnt Creek, where the debt money had come from. The mystery circulated for years, generating theories in proportion to the distance between the theorist and the facts. Margaret Halverson believed it had come from someone who had known Tobias, an old friend, a debt repaid, some kindness from the past traveling west after him. She found the theory comfortable and kept it. Seth knew, or he believed he knew, and the certainty had been building in him since January of that year, since the morning he had stood in the doorway and noticed the shadows under Cord's eyes and the new cut on his knuckle, and the particular quality of that single nod. Not surprise, but the response of a man absorbing information about a situation he was already managing. He had added detail to this belief over the years, in the way that a careful person fills in what they know against what they observe, and by the time he was running the shop himself, he had a picture that was complete enough to satisfy. He never said anything to his mother about what he believed. Some questions, once answered, changed the thing they were asked about, and the thing itself was already enough. Margaret Halverson continued, for many years, to look in Cord's direction in church and at the general store with an expression that had the quality of a question she had decided not to ask. A look that was not gratitude exactly, because gratitude toward an unknown has no face to put on, but something adjacent to it, something that occupied the same neighborhood and had no cleaner name. Cord, when he felt that look, kept his eyes on whatever was in front of him. Not from discomfort, not from guilt, from the sense of proportion that had cost him a long time to develop and that he protected with the same care he gave to anything he had paid for dearly. He had done what he had done. It was done. The farm was there. The boy had grown into something solid and capable and honest. The fire needed feeding every morning, which it always had, which it always would, for as long as he was there to feed it. For a man like Elias Cord, that was not everything. It was enough, which is not the same thing, and which he understood was the best that honest accounting was likely to produce. He went back to the fire. The fire breathed.